Kia ora Aotearoa, good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, commentators and politicians. Joining me tonight to review the week is the General Secretary of the Rail and Maritime Transport Union, Wayne Butson, and the General Secretary of the Unite Union, newspaper columnist and political commentator, Matt McCarten. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, unemployment is up to 6.8%. Where are the jobs, Mr. Key? Issue 2, more cuts and contracting out at Kiwi Rail. Are we gutting this asset? And issue 3, has injecting a false competition model between the ports failed New Zealand strategically? Plus we'll wrap with a final thought, but let's start the show with issue 1. The predictions were 6.5%, but unemployment increased to 6.8% with the release of last week's employment figures. Matt, the National Party ideologically don't believe it's the role of the government to provide jobs. They see it as the role as creating the environment where jobs grow. How politically sustainable is that position?
Well, to be fair, I think that we've had that sort of since the 1980s, is where both parties have believed in this nonsense of the free market. If we just do that, you'll get jobs. Well, what it actually creates is a drive down to the bottom of lowering the wages, and that the jobs become less secure and you get part-time jobs. So yes, the unemployment rate went up. There were 2,000 less jobs last week. What is surprising now, how accepted that is. That you were saying sort of before the show that this wasn't even mentioned in any of the media all over the weekend. And the Labour spokesperson on employment, I won't embarrass him by saying who he is, didn't put out a statement. No. Now, the old days is, when you're about workers, the most important thing is the dignity of work. So not only have we got lower paid jobs now and less secure, that even when there's less of them, there's merely a murmur. But this is the first show that actually mentions it, and I'm glad you raised it first up.
Are you concerned that we've got a real unemployment rate of almost 15% when you include
it's huge.
When you include people who are under?
No. And that's right. If you work 1 hour a week, you're classified as employed. You know, and is that everyone now knows, and certainly in the industries I'm involved in, which is part-time industries, our union Unite, it's that everyone is reporting they're getting less hours. So it's not just the unemployment figure, it's the unemployment figure. And what we've got in this country, of course, is people underemployed but also overemployed. That we, and all the stats across the world, New Zealand is either first or second, and every survey which comes is the amount of hours our full-time workers work. And so that's the problem. There's no regulation with employment, just let it rip.
Are you increasingly seeing bosses using the recession as a justification of, well, you can put up with it, or you can either lump it or leave it? Are you seeing
they're more open about it, I think, Wayne. Right. They've always been of that view. But yes, in fact, I was at a negotiation just this morning, and they don't want to pay any increase. In fact, what they're now saying is, we'll give you 2% increase if you work for nothing for 2% of your time. So that they want the workers to start work 10 minutes early for nothing, and so they give a 2% increase, but it's actually a 0 increase. But you work for nothing. Now, you may think this is a shock, and you think, which mongrel sort of multinational is it? Well, it's a government department.
Oh, how surprising!
So that's their view on it.
Yes.
And they said to our organisers this morning, well, if they don't like it, they'd go and find work elsewhere. So your point exactly.
Wayne, nowhere is the government's free market employment solution more visible than at Kiwi Rail, where New Zealand jobs building the rolling stock were beaten by cheaper Chinese imports. How has the cheaper option worked out for Kiwi Rail?
Oh, I think it's been an unmitigated disaster. You know, the documents around the success, with inverted commas, of the Chinese locomotives and the wagons has all come to light, as the truth always does. And, you know, Kiwi Rail have purchased 20 of these Chinese locos. One is up on blocks being scavenged for parts to keep some of the others operating. And they're struggling to put 12 functioning locomotives into service every day, which is their service level agreement with Kiwi Rail Freight. And so we actually think that this is being replicated in the Chinese wagons. You've seen the brakes and all of that. We just believe that when you go out and you buy this stuff from China, this $2 shop at best product, if we'd been able to be given chance for Kiwis to actually build these products in New Zealand, we know that actually we would have ended up with a world-class product. But even more, we have it's not a unique rail system here in New Zealand. It's 3'6" gauge, it's 18-ton axle load, and there are other railways around the world which are exactly the same. They're purchasing locos as well. I have to say, no first world country like ourselves is sourcing its locomotives out of China. And so Tasmania, for example, with exactly the same gauge and restrictions we have, they're purchasing locos out of Canada. The acid test will be when those locomotives start landing in Canada. Let's just see if they have the same teething troubles as our wonderful Chinese product.
Now, my understanding was that the pitch to have them built here and the cost overseas was actually pretty close. So we're not talking a huge difference in cost to the taxpayer. If we'd gone with New Zealand made, would we?
We went jointly with the Dunedin City Council. We commissioned Burrell to do a study, a cost and infrastructure study. They did that report. And the report came out and said if you took into account the wider social and economic benefits, then actually building the locomotives here in New Zealand would be a huge success story. It would create employment in areas where there is low employment at present, because remember when this was in the domain, Fisher and Paykel had just closed Dunedin. All those manufacturing jobs had been lost, and so here was an opportunity to soak them up, plus also all of the apprenticeship training that it would have freed up. And so the Burrell report said very, very clearly it was within Kiwi. We were having conversations with Kiwi Rail as well, saying, yep, we have terms and conditions of employment, but we don't want these to be a barrier to us getting this work. We're willing to talk to you about flexibility, about how we can all work smarter, higher levels of productivity. Let's actually get asset utilisation. Workshops are a big asset, a lot of capital investment. Let's actually see if we can get it going 24/7, where actually the productivity and utilisation will go through the roof. But actually we just couldn't get over first base. And so I just think it's to this government's shame. It's to certainly the shame of the Kiwi Rail Board that we've ended up with these products from China and they're actually the unmitigated disaster they are. I don't believe Jim Quinn when he says the Chinese are picking up the whole tab for all of the stuff around the locos and wagons. If, as he says, they were a bespoke design done by us, if I was a manufacturer and I built it the way I was told to build it and there were problems, I'd be arguing around the margins as to whether it was my responsibility. There's also the fact that the locos aren't there ready to pull the trains, and so those trains have to move somehow, and so there will be a consequential cost around that as well.
Matt, doesn't Kiwi Rail's decision to buy cheaper Chinese-made rolling stock highlight the blunt bottom line realities of global capitalism? Do we just have to accept a higher unemployment rate as a byproduct of competing in the global market?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head in what Wayne is saying. It's not so much as a Chinese product, it's about any product which is bought into the country, and it's the cheap, let's get it the cheapest we can, because that's how a board of directors thinks, right? We have to maximise profits, let's do it on the cheap. But because we have a wider responsibility, the state does, and this is why we've always had state-owned assets, because they are the strategic assets or the enablers to build an economy. We talk about a high-waged, high-skilled economy. Well, how do you get that? You know, through tourism and hamburgers. You know? Come on, you've actually got to invest in it. What Wayne is saying, absolutely right. Dunedin, closing down the Fisher and Paykel, developing industries, getting high-skilled jobs and making them internally. See, that's when you take a you know, an NZ Inc. approach. You know, when you say it's an economic responsibility as the state is the player. What we've had now is everyone is doing their own thing, and obviously they think about the market. How can I get it for the cheapest? And Wayne will know better than I, but you know, we've all been around. We know perfectly well what happens. They think 1 quarter ahead.
Yep.
If it's a disaster, in 3 years' time, it's a whole new board of directors, right?
Yep.
They just
Yep.
move on to
Yep.
the next one.
Yep.
And that's the point. It's called accountability.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in Kiwi Rail, we've had the Aratiri lengthening and the shambles and debacle that was around that. We've had the Chinese wagons. We've had the Chinese locos. We've got a huge legacy of very, very poor decision making. And yet you look at the decision makers and they're all still there.
Yeah.
If we were talking about workers and they do those sorts of mistakes, they'd be gone.
There's different
One
rules
of the
for
things in
directors
this-
and the CEOs.
Look, I
They just
agree.
move around.
I agree. And if you take the
Anyway, you're
latest,
just annoying us.
the
now.
latest job,
Everyone at home will be thinking, God, why don't, you know, we were just driving them nuts. You need to move on and give us something to cheer us up, brother.
Yeah.
That railway, you know, it was ours.
That's
we
right.
sold it off to crooks
Yep.
who then routed it
Yep.
and
Yep.
grabbed everything they could. We had to buy it back, and now they're routing it again. They're going to sell it off again.
If the government doesn't tackle the high dollar, can manufacturers and exporters ever hope to compete?
Well, they still can, because they just have to think more cleverly. But what they're doing is that the government just keeps going the free market, which means a country, you know, east of Tasmania in the world, near the Antarctic, will always get screwed.
Yeah.
That's why when you're a big country like the States or Europe, the free market, well, yes, because you're dominant, or
that's
China.
right, that's right.
Free market, brother, no problem. Let's all pay $1 an hour to our workers, and so we can compete with China. Just or India or Brazil. Ridiculous.
Final question to both of you. Let's talk Eurozone collapse. Let's talk higher American unemployment. Let's talk slowing China. What do you think the unemployment rate's going to get to? 6.8? Are we going to see it top 7?
I think that there's certainly no indicators from this government that they have any sort of a strategy for developing jobs, for developing growth. I mean, we're 2 years on from Canterbury earthquake. I remember everyone saying, oh yes, the earthquake's all bad and everything, but wow, once this economy starts going, we're going to be booming, and it's going to be this, and how are we going to find the labour to go to Christchurch, and all those sorts of things. And the simple fact is the jobs aren't there, the rebuild's not there, nothing but complaints are coming out. We had all of our container terminal workers in Timaru made redundant the other week. And where's the outcry from the media saying, oh, all these people have got to do is just move up the road to the jobs? The reason that's not happening is because the jobs aren't there.
7 point, will we go over 7% unemployment?
Well, yes, but it's all just you flip a coin, because it's all just the market. And as the economy, it doesn't pick up, and we've been disguising it by borrowing. So when that ends, you know, and we're counting on Christchurch, which is to some extent they've been able to cover things by saying this is going to happen. But once the confidence starts going, and then people realise there isn't a plan. The only jobs plan this government said they'd have was a cycle track.
And how many
and that
jobs
was
that created?
4 years
Yes,
ago, and I
yes,
think we're up
yes.
to 25 jobs.
Yes, yes,
so at this
yes.
rate, I don't know, about 1 million years before we can get full employment.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, 181 job losses at the Infrastructure and Engineering Division and more contracting out of services are making critics suspicious that Kiwi Rail is being gutted and readied for sale. Wayne, can you tell the country that these cutbacks to rail maintenance will not impact on any safety on the network?
No, in fact I can't. In fact, if you take, as Matt said before, we have a rail business in New Zealand that's been through hell and back again, really. And so it's gone from nationalised to privatised to a mix between a public-private partnership, which is the time when Toll operated the above rail stuff and the Crown owned the below rail, and they constantly argued about what the subsidy would be from the Crown to operate the track and so on. And when those negotiations broke down, out of pure frustration, Cullen went in and said, you're out of here, we're buying the whole lot back, because it just makes it easier. And so what we've seen over time is some money has gone in, but the turnaround plan, the much vaunted turnaround plan, has always had at its core the fact that Kiwi Rail must become a self-sustainable rail transport business. Well, I have to tell you, That's impossible.
Right.
It is impossible to run a viable transport company and to create your own infrastructure at the same time.
Sure.
You just can't do it. There isn't a trucking company in New Zealand that could manufacture its own highways to operate its trucks. And so it's actually fundamentally flawed for this to be put in place.
Because it's
And
ideology, isn't it? It's all ideology about this. About they say that all this is possible. Because we know perfectly well that rail is about it's part of the infrastructure of transport in the country. It always has when we set it up. You know, the whole thing was to actually move lots of stuff from ports to centres and so on and so on. What we deregulate the trucking industry. You've got these big bloody trucks driving down the road and running all the thing, more roads. How does a rail operate next to that? It's not possible.
Well, it can't operate next to it while the roads are subsidised by the
of
taxpayer,
course.
and railway has to pay for its own
Exactly.
infrastructure. That's the whole point. And so Jim Quinn's saying things like, we have to cut our cloth.
That's right.
We've got too many track workers. And so that may on its face be true. If it was a simple cutting of the cloth, then actually the union's not opposed to that.
But
You know,
we
you've got
also
to live
know
within your means.
that cutting the cloth or cutting the workers out is always the precursor to selling things.
Exactly.
To make it look like it's profitable.
Is rail treated in this manner because it lacks the political muscle of the private trucking industry?
No, I think it's ideological.
Right.
It's actually that the right-wing sort of ideologues think that somehow they can all compete sort of equally. But as Wayne points out, who built the roads? You know, who uses the roads? You know, and so they don't have all these fixed costs. The whole thing about rail was actually to move goods all around the country as almost like, not so much a social good, but actually it's an integrated responsibility not to clog up the roads and so on and so on. But what we had is the ideology of and the trucking sort of industry, the roads. National Party ex-MPs become the lobbyists for these roading transport, and we've been subsidising them through our bloody nose, and our railway has been hurt because of it, and then we blame them.
Well, 12 billion for roads.
None
for rail.
That's right.
Well,
Is
rest my case.
Kiwi Rail's CEO Jim Quinn planning a Ports of Auckland style contracting out agenda here? Is that your suspicion?
Well, that's our suspicion. He vehemently denies it. But the simple fact of the matter is, if you look at the Trade Me site with jobs, if you look around the place, there are advertisements from the likes of Fulton and Hogan and John Holland. These are both highly successful companies. They wouldn't put ads in newspapers to recruit staff if they didn't think they actually had work for them to do. And so that's the problem. I have to say, Quinn is adamant. He is not contracting out, but the reality is, if you're Fulton and Hogan, why are you putting ads for workers? Why are you buying vehicles? Why are you fitting them up to do rail contract work? Our members are saying there's all these vehicles parked up all over the place. They've got the high rail equipment for riding on the track. It's all fitted. There's only one place in New Zealand you can go to get the high rail equipment put on the trucks, because Kiwi Rail owns the intellectual property to it. And so it just seems to us that it's either the best TUI's ad in the country, or actually we are all just cynically misunderstanding Mr. Quinn and his management team.
Getting back to that public good, Nat, if we want our motorways to be more efficient, shouldn't we be investing into Kiwi Rail to incentivise rail use rather than cutting back $200 million on track investment over the next 3 years? Well, I mean, it's a public service that we're running into the ground here, isn't it?
Oh, well, yes, of course, and I think that Wayne's right, is you want the same, you want an integrated approach. You know, it's sea, rail and road. It's and air, it's all of these things. And so you've got to take, it's about moving goods and people from one point to another. And of course you've got to do it, but what the government does, it's almost sort of chooses which one, and somehow it's almost like this hatred of rail. You know, how dare we have this rail? You think, duh? You know? And probably because the people who like buying things and getting rich off taxpayer-built things have already scored everything they can sort of out of rail. There's nothing more to get in it. And so that, and they might pay it. But, you know, anyone with even common sense is that we build more and more roads because we need them, because we're taking money away from rail. Now, wouldn't it be good to subsidise rail and get the big articulate lorries off the road. None of those lorries have been built in this country. They're all imported. These poor guys who drive them are contracted working 60, 70, 80 hours a week on bugger all. You know, they've got to pay off these gigs, you know, and your contract is dependent though. So you are a worker, bonded labour actually. And so you've got all of that, which, you know, and so the destruction of roads and so on and so on. So, you know, our forefathers back in, you know, 100 years plus, knew that, and they took this position as we take a New Zealand whole approach. We build rail, we build roads, we have the national airline, the shipping company we used to own, because we actually know that that's a social good and an economic necessity.
Final question on this. Are the government preparing Kiwi Rail for privatisation? Your thoughts?
I don't think they are preparing it for privatisation.
Because no one will buy it.
I think
they've already screwed everything.
I think what they're doing is they have issued very clear instructions that Kiwi Rail is to become the logistical transport logistical conveyor belt for Fonterra and Solid Energy, and one or two chosen few like Main Freight and Peter Baker Transport and so on. And so you'll see all the money is going into where the milk routes are. You'll see the bit that goes from Auckland to Tauranga and so on around the place. All the other lines, forget about the future or whatever may happen in this country.
Exactly
if it doesn't, including passenger,
get rid of that.
If it doesn't actually add value through Fonterra or Solid Energy, then they're not interested. The criminality of all of this, of course, is that the taxpayer is paying to, I mean, we're paying to clean up the lakes and rivers for whatever happened to user pays and fresh water. But we're now also seeing the taxpayer is expected to pay for the movement of freight on the network for these big companies.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, more job losses announced last month at Timaru Port highlights the problem of forcing competition models over wider economic interests. Wayne, has injecting a false competition model between the ports failed New Zealand strategically?
Well, to be fair, and I hate being fair, but to be fair, that competition model has actually been there for a long period of time, and a long time people have been saying it's got to stop. And so what we've had for probably the last 10 to 15 years is the shipping lines come in, they say, oh, we're going to bring a boat to New Zealand, who wants it? And all the port companies stick up their hand and they say, we'll do it cheaper, we'll do it this way, and then they turn on organised labour, because these are organised workers in the ports. They turn on organised labour and they say, we have to deal to you if we're going to keep the jobs. And they put all sorts of pressure, and for years we've had the ports and the organised labour just dropping their charges, dropping their pants in order to be screwed by Maersk and Fonterra and so on. And so it's been a race to the bottom. Where we've got to now is actually we're at the baseline. Those things can't happen. And so now we're seeing the true real cost of this policy that's been going for a while starting to hit home. And so we're seeing the ports actually not being able to compete and exiting the business. And this is criminal because it's New Zealand Inc. money. If you have a look at Port of Timaru, all of that port is owned by the South Canterbury community. All of the port, all of the container cranes, all of the forklifts, everything to do with it, paid for by those ratepayers and owned through the regional council. And simply because someone in a boardroom in Europe clicks their fingers, say we're not going there anymore, all of that asset is essentially worthless and those skilled workers have no jobs. The criminal part about it is we only saw a short time ago the absolute essence of necessity for Timaru to be there because Littleton couldn't take any ships and then Littleton was able to pick it up. It had container cranes, it had forklifts. What you have to ask yourself is, if Timaru wasn't there and Christchurch happened, would the recovery have been as effective in terms of getting services and product into Christchurch?
Matt, we're seeing a similar attempt to force competition models into education with league tables. When does the pursuit of competition become counterproductive?
Well, you know, that competition is always put up as this is actually there's no alternative. This is the mantra. This is like a given. And what we have is false competition in the ports, for example. You know, like the smart thing is all the ports, we should be united because all these importers are bringing Maersk and the big companies, they are playing everyone off and saying, duh, You know, wouldn't it be the smart thing saying, yeah, what's the price?
Yeah.
Because they've got to bring it in, in the country, but that aside. But going to the teaching, how obscene, you know, to actually, you know, set a system up where wealthier schools with more resources, you know, will always do better in a competition. You know, if a kid is starting to, you know, if you're running a mile, that's one thing, but when one kid is starting 200 metres back, it's not equal. And so what actually happens under this model, the league tables, everyone says, well, it's what I want to know, you know, and comparing apples with oranges. The whole thing is we've got to make the local school a good school, not sort of like, I'll bus my kids across town to another school, and you know and I know that the wealthier schools will do very well because they can always get money off the parents, and that the working class districts will actually find their parents are working 2 jobs, more than 40 hours a week, they're struggling along, and they're going to put money up, and so on and so on. So it's just natural, and what happens, the market doesn't work, because what will happen, you know, it's happened in the States and everywhere else, and I don't use it like race, but let's use class. Poor kids will be left in poor school, which is just a cycle. Richer kids will get the options, of course, and parents will keep paying as as it is. We'll have 2 systems. Then we'll have the nuts will come in and start having their ideological schools, you know, like creationism and so on and so on, and all that which comes with it. And we will have a very unequal society, and education will come down. New Zealand already ranks always in the top 5 in the educational world, and people just need to know that. We actually have a very good system. Can it be a change and tweaked? Absolutely, because it fails a lot of Polynesian and Māori and poor kids, and I think that the education sort of institutions need to get in front of that instead of allowing the right to use some failure to say we must do it this way. And the right wing have only got one agenda, it's to privatise our education and make money. That's what they're going.
We're going to wrap the show. Wayne, your final word this week is? My
final word is we all need to group together to make sure that we as a country don't lose Kiwi Rail, that it remains a tool, an economic tool for the betterment of New Zealand Inc. And we all get in behind and support it before it actually gets driven into the ground with this turnaround plan, which is fundamentally flawed and will not meet the needs of future generations of New Zealand.
Amen, brother. Your final word, Matt?
Well, the good thing is that New Zealanders get all that. And that's why there's so much opposition against the power companies, the people who founded our modern society. You get the utilities and the transport, and they are community owned, not there to make profits for others, but to deliver a service. So I think New Zealanders know it. I want people who are listening to this today, were watching today, they get out and get the petition off the website, so to keep our assets. They actually get into that, get the download, because the government is trying to sell off the assets now, and we can actually put a stop to it. So I'm very...
and we need to get rid of them too.
Yeah, well,
well, Labor better get its act together.
Can I say that? Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, man.
In the meantime.
That's it for the show. Check out our Facebook site for ongoing union campaigns and actions, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter account for all the latest show updates. Thank you for watching Aotearoa. Join us again 8 PM next Monday for the Union Report here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Good night, New Zealand.